The nurse placed the newborn in the bassinet and turned around. The room was empty. No husband. No flowers. No overnight bag. Just a single envelope on the chair, unsealed, unsigned, and a name written on the birth certificate that didn't match the woman who had just given birth. The baby's left shoulder was visible above the blanket. And anyone who knew the Calloway family would have gone very still. Why would a woman disappear from a hospital hours after giving birth, and who decided what name went on that certificate? Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. Ethan Calloway had built his entire life around one idea: that chaos was something that happened to other people. At 44, he ran one of the most respected private equity firms on the East Coast. He wore the same style of watch his father gave him at 30. He arrived to every meeting 4 minutes early. Not 5. 4. He believed that if you controlled the small things, the large things rarely had a chance to surprise you. That belief lasted until a Tuesday afternoon in March. He was standing at the head of a glass conference table, 43 floors above the city, walking 8 board members through the final structure of a $2.4 billion merger. The slide behind him showed projected returns. The room was focused. Everything was going exactly as planned. His phone vibrated against the table. He glanced at the screen. A number he didn't recognize. A 617 area code, Boston. He let it go to voicemail without missing a word of his presentation. 30 seconds later, it vibrated again. Same number. He kept talking. His assistant, Claire, slipped quietly into the room, which she never did during board presentations. She set a folded note on the table beside his hand and stepped back. He didn't open it immediately. He finished his sentence. Then he looked down. St. Mercy Hospital. Please call back. Urgent. He excused himself without explanation. The call lasted 4 minutes. He stood in the hallway outside the conference room with his back against the wall, and by the end of it, he hadn't moved a single inch. A nurse explained, calmly and carefully, that a woman had been admitted under his family name the previous evening. She had gone into labor at 11 p.m. She had delivered a healthy baby boy at 4:17 a.m. And sometime before 7, she had gathered her belongings and walked out of the hospital without signing a single discharge form. Without telling anyone. Without taking the baby. The baby was still there. Ethan's first thought was not grief. It wasn't even anger. It was something quieter and more disorienting than either of those. Diane had a miscarriage 8 months ago. He knew this because he had been there. He had sat in the waiting room of the OB clinic on a Wednesday afternoon while she was in with the doctor. He remembered the color of the chairs, a pale, institutional green that he'd stared at for 40 minutes. He remembered the drive home. How she'd sat in the passenger seat with her forehead against the window. How he had reached across and held her hand and she had let him, but hadn't held back. He had cried that night, alone in the bathroom, so she wouldn't have to watch him. That was 8 months ago. She had been pregnant then. And now a hospital was telling him a baby had been born. He drove to St. Mercy in 18 minutes. He doesn't remember the drive. The nurse who met him in the lobby was kind in the way hospital staff learn to be kind, steady and careful, saying just enough. She walked him down a quiet corridor on the 3rd floor, past a row of rooms with soft lights and the distant sound of a newborn somewhere crying. She stopped outside a room at the end of the hall and opened the door without ceremony. It was a standard recovery room. Pale walls. One window with the blinds half open. A bassinet near the center of the room, the kind with a clear plastic frame so the nurses can see the baby from the doorway. On the chair beside the bed, there was an envelope. The nurse gave him a moment. He walked to the bassinet first. The baby was awake. Dark eyes that didn't focus on anything yet, the way newborn eyes don't. Small fingers curled at the sides of a white hospital blanket. The baby made no sound. Just looked up at nothing with the kind of calm that only the very new and the very old ever seemed to manage. Ethan stood over the bassinet and something happened that he couldn't explain then and would struggle to explain for a long time afterward. He felt something. Not recognition exactly, the child was a stranger to him in every way he could name. But something. A pull. A familiarity with no source. The way a smell can take you somewhere before you understand where you're going. He stood there for a moment longer than he intended. Then he picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed. Inside, there was a single piece of folded paper. 3 words, handwritten. He read them once, and then he folded the paper back and held it in his hand and stood very still. The nurse appeared in the doorway. She was holding a document, the kind with multiple copies, the kind hospitals need signed before anything can move forward. She said she was sorry to bring this up right now. But there was a matter with the birth certificate that required his attention. She handed it to him. The father listed on the certificate was E. Calloway. His initial. His last name. But the mother's name was not Diane. It was a name he had never seen before in his life. If you felt that, you're not alone. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think she really is? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The truth gets darker from here, and you won't want to miss it. Ethan didn't go home right away. He sat in the hospital parking garage for 23 minutes with his hands on the steering wheel and the engine off. The birth certificate was on the passenger seat. The name at the top, not Diane's, faced upward. He didn't turn it over. His lawyer, David Park, answered on the first ring. Ethan gave him 4 sentences. David didn't ask for more. He said he'd have what he could find within the hour and that Ethan should go home and stay off his phone until he called back. Ethan drove home. The house was quiet in the way houses get when something is wrong, but the furniture doesn't know it yet. David called while Ethan was still standing in the front hallway with his coat on. Diane's phone had last pinged a cell tower near Logan Airport at 6:48 that morning, 2.5 hours after she left the hospital. It had been dark since. No outgoing calls. No messages. No location. Her car had been found in the long-term parking lot at Terminal B. And her passport, which they both kept in the fireproof box in the home office, was gone. Just hers. Ethan walked upstairs. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a moment before he went inside. Everything looked the same. The duvet was smooth on her side, the way she always left it. Her reading glasses were on the nightstand. A half-empty glass of water that had been there long enough to leave a ring on the wood. He went to her closet. A section was empty. Not ransacked, empty. She'd taken what she needed and left the rest. Her good coats were still hanging. The dress she wore to his company's anniversary dinner last fall was still there, the one she'd spent 40 minutes deciding on. Her shoes were lined up neatly, most of them still in their places. But her wedding photos were on the wall. All 3 of them. She hadn't taken a single one. Ethan stood there looking at them for a moment, the 2 of them outside the church, her laughing at something he'd said right before the photographer counted down, and then he turned around and walked out of the closet because he didn't know what to do with what he was feeling and he didn't have time to figure it out. Their housekeeper, Rosa, had been with the family for 6 years. She was standing at the end of the hallway when he came out, holding a small box with both hands the way people hold things they're not sure they should have touched. She said she'd found it while she was straightening the bedroom. Behind the mirror on Diane's side, the one that leaned against the wall. She said she thought he should be the one to open it. It was a plain white box, the kind pharmacies use. Inside, folded twice, was a single ultrasound printout. He didn't need to read much. Just the date at the top right corner. Printed clearly. Stamped by whatever machine had produced it. For months after the miscarriage. The one he'd sat in the waiting room for. The one he'd driven her home from. The one he'd cried about alone so she wouldn't have to see him. She had been pregnant again. Or still. And she hadn't said a word. Rosa left quietly. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed with the ultrasound in his hand and tried to find a version of events where this made sense. Where there was a reason. Where he had missed something small instead of something enormous. He was still sitting there when his phone rang. The ringtone was the one Lily had picked out herself, a xylophone sound that she thought was hilarious. He'd never changed it because she loved it too much. He answered before he thought about what he was going to say. Daddy. Her voice was small and very certain, the way 6-year-olds are when they've been thinking about something all day. Is Mommy coming to my recital tomorrow? He opened his mouth. It's the one with the butterflies, Lily added, as if that would help. I have the big wings. He closed his eyes. I know, Bug. So is she coming? He didn't answer right away. The silence lasted 1 second too long, and Lily, who noticed everything, went quiet on her end. Daddy? I'll be there, he said. I promise. She seemed to accept that. They talked for 2 more minutes about nothing, what she'd had for dinner, whether her teacher had remembered the class hamster, and then she said good night and hung up. Ethan set the phone on the bed. He looked at the ultrasound still in his hand, and then he set that down too. He went back to the hospital that evening. Not because he'd been asked to. Because the baby was still there, alone in a room at the end of a corridor, and he didn't know who else was coming. The floor supervisor met him at the nurse's station. She was professional and careful and clearly had been briefed on the situation. She confirmed what the certificate had started to tell him. Diane had registered under a different last name entirely. Not Calloway. A name Ethan had never heard before. She'd presented matching ID. A driver's license, a health insurance card, both in that name. Both real enough to clear admissions. She hadn't made a mistake. She had planned it. The supervisor said there was something else. She asked if he'd like to speak with the attending physician before he went in to see the baby. He said yes. The doctor was a calm man in his 50s who had clearly delivered news in difficult rooms before. He asked Ethan to sit down, which Ethan didn't do. He said that during labor, there had been a visitor. Not someone listed as a support person. A man who had arrived at the unit, given a name that got him through the door, and stayed for approximately 40 minutes. He left before the baby was born. The staff had noted it because it was irregular, but Diane had confirmed verbally that she knew him and that he was allowed to stay. So they hadn't intervened. Ethan asked if they had him on camera. The doctor nodded and walked him to the security office. The footage was grainy in the way hospital hallway cameras always are, washed out, slightly blurred. But the figure who stepped out of the elevator and walked toward the maternity ward was visible enough. The build. The way he walked. The specific habit of running one hand through his hair before entering a room. Ethan knew that walk. He had grown up watching it. It was Marcus. His younger brother had been in that hospital while Diane was in labor. And he hadn't called. Hadn't texted. Hadn't said a single word. Something about this chapter will stay with you. If you felt it, share your theory in the comments. Who is Marcus protecting, and why? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next chapter changes everything you think you understand. Ethan called Marcus at 9 p.m. and said 3 words. I saw the footage. There was a pause on the other end. Not the pause of someone caught off guard. The pause of someone who had been waiting for this call and still hadn't decided what to say. Marcus came over 20 minutes later. They sat in Ethan's study with the door closed. No drinks. No small talk. Ethan put his phone on the desk between them with the security still image pulled up, Marcus stepping off the elevator at St. Mercy, 3rd floor, maternity ward, timestamped 2:11 a.m. Marcus looked at it. He didn't look away and pretend he didn't recognize himself. He didn't offer an excuse. He just nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something he already knew was over. I was there, he said. I'm not going to lie about that. Then tell me why. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He was 39, 4 years younger than Ethan, and right now he looked older than both of them combined. I was protecting Diane. From what? Marcus shook his head. Marcus. Ethan's voice was quiet. That was the thing about Ethan when he was truly angry, he got quieter, not louder. From what? I can't tell you that right now. Ethan waited. Marcus held his gaze, and what Ethan saw in his brother's face was not what he expected. It wasn't guilt exactly. It wasn't defiance. It was fear. But not fear of Ethan. Whatever Marcus was afraid of was somewhere else entirely, outside that room, outside that house. You need to leave, Ethan said. Marcus left. The next morning, Ethan hired a private investigator named Sandra Cho. She came recommended by his lawyer, David, who said she was thorough and fast and didn't make things up to extend her billing hours. Ethan gave her 2 names, Marcus Calloway and Diane Calloway née Whitfield. He said he wanted documented history. Everything that could be found. Sandra called back in 36 hours. What she had was simple and brutal. Over a 2-year period, starting around the time Ethan had been in Singapore managing the Southeast Asia expansion, a stretch of travel that had kept him out of the country for weeks at a time, Marcus and Diane had met regularly. Coffee shops, mostly. A few lunch spots. All documented on Marcus's personal credit card. The meetings were consistent. Not frantic or hidden in any visible way. Just regular. Like 2 people who had developed a habit. The audience already knew what they thought this meant. So did Ethan. But Sandra's next line stopped him. He was also paying rent, she said. What? A residential lease. Monthly wire transfers, Marcus's personal account. Going back for years. She gave him the address. For years. That was before Singapore. Before the miscarriage. Before any of it. Ethan drove to the address alone. It was a clean building in a quiet neighborhood, not flashy, not hidden, just ordinary. The building super let him into the unit with a court order Sandra had helped expedite. The apartment was small. 2 rooms. It smelled faintly of something, a candle, maybe, or a particular soap, that stopped Ethan in the doorway for a half second before he could keep moving. The place was almost too tidy. No clutter. No personal mess. Like someone had cleaned it recently and carefully. The kitchen counter was bare. The bedroom had a made bed and nothing on the nightstands. But on the refrigerator, held up by a single magnet, was a child's drawing. It was done in crayon. A house with a triangle roof. A woman with yellow hair. A small round baby shape. And next to the baby, slightly taller than the others, a figure with no specific features, just a shape. Labeled in the careful, large printing of a young child. D. Not daddy. Not a name. Just a letter. Ethan stood in front of that refrigerator for a long time. He didn't know whose child had drawn it. He didn't know what D was meant to be. He didn't know if the woman with yellow hair was Diane, or someone else, or nobody real at all. He took a photo of it and left. Lily was still awake when he got home, which she wasn't supposed to be. She appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, the ones with the small stars on them, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear. "Daddy, who's the baby?" He had not told her much. Just that there was a baby at the hospital who needed someone to look after him for a little while. She had accepted this the way 6-year-olds accept things, fully, without question, then circling back later with the part that actually mattered to her. "I don't know yet, Bug," he said. She thought about this. Her rabbit dangled. "Is he going to live with us?" "I don't know." Another pause. She pulled the rabbit up and hugged it against her chest, and then she said, very seriously, "Can I still have a brother someday?" Ethan looked at his daughter at the top of the stairs with her star pajamas and her rabbit and her entirely reasonable question, and he turned around and walked to the kitchen before she could see his face. He stood at the sink with the tap running and said nothing. Sandra called just after 11. She had pulled Marcus's financial records further, specifically a wire transfer, substantial, from Marcus's private account to a medical clinic 18 months ago. She had a name and an address. She had already made contact. The clinic was a fertility clinic. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Sandra called again at 7 a.m. with what the clinic had confirmed under subpoena. The procedure on record had used genetic material belonging to a member of the Calloway family. The file showed the donor's information in a partially deleted field. Someone had tried to remove it, not completely, just enough to make it harder to read. The portion that remained was not Marcus's name. It was the beginning of another name entirely. And Ethan's hand went cold around the phone because the letters that were still visible, just the first few, just enough, pointed somewhere he hadn't thought to look. Whatever you're thinking right now, hold on to it. Drop your theory in the comments, because this story is about to go somewhere none of us expected. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there when Chapter 4 drops. The fertility clinic would not return Ethan's calls. They were polite about it, a receptionist, then an administrator, then a lawyer, but the answer was the same at every level. The records he was requesting were under legal seal. Until that seal was lifted by whoever had filed it, no information could be released. Not the donor name. Not the procedure details. Nothing. Ethan asked who had filed the seal. There was a pause. It had come from the Calloway Family Trust. Ethan knew every person with authority over that trust. It wasn't a long list. There was himself. There was Marcus. And there was their father, Richard Calloway, 71 years old, retired for 6 years following a stroke that had left him slower but not gone. Still sharp enough, on his good days, to know exactly what he was doing. Ethan called Marcus. Marcus didn't answer. He got in his car and drove 40 minutes north to his father's house. Richard Calloway lived in the original family home, a large, older property outside the city that Ethan and Marcus had grown up in. It had a full-time caregiver now, a quiet man named Paul who met Ethan at the door and said Richard was having a decent morning, which meant he was awake and talking, which was not always guaranteed. Ethan found his father in the sitting room near the window. He was in his chair, a blanket over his lap, looking out at the garden. He was thinner than the last time Ethan had visited, 2 months ago. The stroke had taken something from him that hadn't come back and probably wasn't going to. But when Richard heard his son's voice, he turned his head and his eyes were clear. "Ethan." He said it the way he always had, short, with a slight nod, like a confirmation. Ethan sat across from him. He didn't start with the clinic. He started with the name. "Dad," he said. "I need to ask you about Diane." Richard's right hand was resting on the arm of the chair. The moment Ethan said her name, the hand moved. Just a tremor, small, visible. Not the kind that came from his condition. Ethan had watched his father's hands for 6 years. He knew the difference between a medical tremor and a human one. This was human. "Dad. Did you know her?" "Before I did." Richard's jaw tightened. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, and what moved across his face was not confusion. It was something older and heavier than that. He opened his mouth. "She came to me." 4 words. Clear and deliberate. Then Paul appeared in the doorway, asked if everything was all right, and Richard closed his eyes, not from fatigue, but from decision. He was done. Whatever door he had cracked open, he shut it again, and he did not open it for the rest of Ethan's visit. Ethan drove home with those 4 words and no idea what they meant. Sandra called that evening with Diane's background. She had gone further this time, not just recent history but origins. Diane had grown up in a small town called Harwick, roughly 400 miles away. Modest background. Single mother. The mother's name was Anna Whitfield. And Anna Whitfield had worked as a housekeeper for the Calloway estate 22 years ago. Ethan sat with that information and let it arrange itself slowly. 22 years ago, he had been in college. Marcus had been 15. Their father had been running the family company at the height of its expansion. And a woman named Anna Whitfield had worked in the house they grew up in. If Diane was Anna's daughter, and everything pointed to that, then Diane had been a young child when her mother worked for the family. Too young to have any real memory of the place. Too young for it to have been anything deliberate on her part. But it meant something. He just didn't know what yet. He went to his father's study. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He told himself he was just looking at the bookshelves, the old files in the cabinet, the framed photos on the credenza that Richard had never updated. His father's study was a museum of a particular era, everything frozen around 2003, before things got complicated. He found the photograph in the bottom drawer of the desk, in a plain envelope with no label. It was a house staff photograph. The kind large estates used to take every few years, everyone lined up on the front steps, the household staff in their uniforms, a formal record. The year was printed at the bottom. 1998. There were 12 people in the photo. Ethan scanned the faces slowly. He recognized no one until the edge of the frame, a young woman standing slightly apart from the others, the way people stand when they're not sure they belong in a photograph. She looked like Diane. But she wasn't Diane. The age was wrong. Diane would have been born around this time. This woman was in her mid-20s, maybe younger. Dark hair. A particular way of holding herself, straight, composed, a little guarded. She looked like what Diane might look like in 15 years if you worked backward from what Ethan knew of Diane's face. Her mother. It had to be Anna. Ethan turned the photograph over. His father's handwriting was on the back. Richard had always written in a careful, old-fashioned script, the kind taught in schools that no longer existed. There was a name. A date. 1999. And below it, 3 words. Forgive me. Ethan stood in the quiet of his father's study and read those 3 words 4 times. He had walked into this house asking about a fertility clinic and a sealed legal file. He was leaving with something much larger and much older than either of those things, something his father had written down and kept hidden in a drawer for 26 years and still hadn't been able to throw away. Forgive me. For what? That question is going to sit with you. Whatever you're thinking right now, share it in the comments. And if this story is pulling you in, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what's coming in Chapter 5 is the answer everyone wanted, and it's only half the truth. Marcus was already in the building when Ethan arrived at work. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't gone through Claire or scheduled anything. He was just sitting in the chair outside Ethan's office when Ethan stepped off the elevator at 8:14 a.m., unshaved, wearing yesterday's shirt, hands clasped in his lap like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew was coming. Claire looked at Ethan. Ethan gave her a small nod. She picked up her coffee and walked away down the hall. Ethan opened his office door. Marcus stood up and followed him in. Marcus didn't wait for Ethan to sit down. He stood in the middle of the room and started talking, not fast, not rehearsed, but the way someone talks when they've been holding something for so long that the weight of it has simply become unbearable. He and Diane had an affair. It started 2 years ago. Ethan had been in Singapore for most of that stretch, weeks at a time, sometimes longer. Marcus said it wasn't planned. He said that didn't make it better. He said he knew that. It lasted 8 months. He ended it. He was the one who ended it. He wanted Ethan to know that, though he understood it changed nothing. What he didn't know, when he ended it, was that Diane was already pregnant. She told him 4 weeks later. He panicked. He arranged the apartment so she'd have somewhere quiet to go during the pregnancy. He set up the alias so the hospital records wouldn't surface in any way that connected back to Ethan. He arranged the clinic visit because she had needed medical support early on and he didn't know what else to do. He did all of it because he was trying to contain the damage. To protect his brother from something Marcus had caused. He looked at Ethan when he said that last part. He didn't look away. Ethan had been standing near the window the whole time. He hadn't moved. When Marcus finished, the room was very quiet. "Is the baby yours?" Ethan asked. "Yes." No hesitation. Diane told me directly. I have no reason to doubt her. The audience had been right all along. That was the thing about it, everything fit. The meetings, the apartment, the alias, the clinic. Marcus was a Calloway. The birthmark the nursing staff had noted on the baby's left shoulder was a known Calloway trait. Of course it was there. It was Marcus's child. Marcus was the child's father. It was painful and it was a betrayal and it was exactly what everyone had already suspected. Ethan looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You're fired. Get out of this building. David will be in contact about the trust." Marcus nodded. He picked up his jacket from the chair. At the door, he stopped. He started to say something, the beginning of a sentence that might have been an apology, or an explanation, or something else entirely. Then he stopped himself. He walked out. Ethan called David. He told him to begin annulment proceedings. He told him to prepare documentation removing Marcus from all operational roles connected to the family trust. David asked no questions. He said he'd have the first drafts by end of day. Ethan sat in his office for 20 minutes after the call ended. The merger documents were still on his desk from 3 days ago. The slide deck was still open on his laptop, projected returns, shareholder charts, everything carefully ordered. He closed the laptop. He went to the hospital that afternoon. He wasn't sure why, exactly. He told himself it was practical, there were decisions being made about the child's temporary placement, paperwork his lawyer needed him to review in person. But he signed the paperwork quickly and then he didn't leave. He asked the nurse if he could sit with the baby for a while. She brought him to the room, settled the baby into his arms, and left without a word. She had the quiet instinct of someone who understood that certain moments needed to be left alone. Ethan sat in the chair beside the bassinet and held the boy for the first time. He was small in the way all newborns are small, that specific, surprising lightness that no one ever quite prepares you for. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were open, unfocused, moving in the slow, searching way they do in the first days of life. Ethan looked at him. And there it was again. The same feeling from the first night, that pull he couldn't name. That impossible sense of something recognized. He had dismissed it before. He had a reason to dismiss it now. Marcus was the father. The child was family, in a painful and complicated way, and maybe that was all the feeling was. Maybe it was just grief taking a strange shape. He told himself that. He looked at the child for another few minutes. The baby's hand opened and closed against the blanket. Ethan looked away first. He called Sandra from the parking garage. "I need a DNA test," he said. His voice was completely level. "The baby, and my profile from the estate trust file. You have access to that record." A pause on Sandra's end. "You want to confirm it's Marcus's?" "I want to know what the results say." "And Marcus?" "Don't tell him." Sandra called back 48 hours later. Ethan was at his desk. He answered on the first ring. She didn't lead with anything. She just gave him the results. The baby was not Marcus's son. The child's DNA was a match for Ethan's own genetic profile, pulled directly from the estate trust document filed 7 years ago, the one Ethan had submitted voluntarily for inheritance verification purposes. Ethan said nothing. Sandra waited. He set the phone down on his desk without hanging up. He sat very still for a long time. Outside his window, the city moved the way it always did, indifferent, continuous, unbothered by the fact that everything Ethan thought he understood had just shifted completely beneath him. Diane had been pregnant with his child. And she had left without telling him. That silence at the end of the call, that's the moment the whole story changes. Drop your reaction in the comments. If you felt something watching this unfold, subscribe and turn on notifications. The truth still isn't finished, and what's coming will hit harder than anything so far. The DNA results didn't just answer a question. They erased everything Ethan thought the question was. The baby was his. Conceived inside his marriage. Not an affair, not a betrayal by Diane with another man, his own child, carried in secret, hidden behind a fabricated miscarriage, delivered alone in a hospital under a false name, and then left there. Ethan sat with that for a full day before he told anyone. Not David. Not Sandra. Not Lily's nanny, who kept texting asking whether he'd be home for dinner. He sat with it because something underneath the fact of it was pulling at him, something that didn't fit. If the baby was his, then Diane had no reason to run from the pregnancy. She had every legal right. Every social protection. She was his wife. The child was his. So why had she built an entire second life to hide it? He called Sandra the following morning and told her to go deeper on Diane's background. Not recent history. Origins. Everything she could find on Anna Whitfield, Diane's mother, and specifically her time working at the Calloway estate. Sandra had results in 2 days. Anna Whitfield had started working at the estate in the spring of 1997. Housekeeper, live-in during the weeks, with weekends off. She worked there for 2 years. And then, in the late fall of 1999, she left. No resignation on record. No reference letter. No formal documentation of any kind. She was simply gone from the payroll by December of that year. Diane was born the following spring. April 2000. Ethan stared at that date for a long time. He called David and asked him to subpoena the estate's personnel records from 1997 through 2000. David said Richard's attorney would resist. Ethan said to file anyway. The attorney resisted. Exactly as David predicted. His argument was that the records were private family trust documents and not subject to civil disclosure. The judge disagreed. Partial disclosure was ordered within 72 hours. The documents that arrived were incomplete, pages redacted, some entirely blacked out, but enough remained to tell a story. Anna Whitfield's termination had not been a firing. It had been a settlement. A financial agreement, signed in December 1999, releasing the Calloway estate from any future claims. The dollar amount was redacted. But the confidentiality clause was not. It covered, word for word, all matters related to the Calloway family lineage. That was not standard language. That was not boilerplate. Ethan read it 3 times. Then he put the document in his jacket pocket and drove to his father's house. He didn't tell Paul what the visit was about. He asked for 10 minutes alone with Richard. Paul, to his credit, stepped out without argument. Richard was at the window again. Same chair. Same blanket. The garden outside had gone slightly gray in the late afternoon light. Ethan sat down across from him and placed the settlement document on the table between them, facing his father. He didn't speak. He just waited. Richard looked at the document. He didn't pick it up. He didn't read it. He'd read it before, clearly. He recognized it the way you recognize something you wrote yourself. The silence lasted almost a full minute. Then Richard said, "Her name was Anna." Ethan said nothing. "She was kind." Richard's voice was slow, measured, the way speech had become for him since the stroke. I was not good to her. I was not good to her at all." "The settlement," Ethan said. "The settlement was my shame." Richard's jaw tightened. "I was trying to contain something I had already broken. I sent her away with money and a document that meant she couldn't speak. And then he stopped. He looked at his hands. "I never knew if there was a child." Ethan was very still. "You never knew," he repeated. "Not a question. She was gone before I could have known. Before I thought to ask. By the time I understood what I should have done, it was too late to do it." Richard closed his eyes. Not to end the conversation this time. Just the weight of it. Ethan drove home. He sat in his parked car in his own driveway and did the math that had been sitting just out of reach since Sandra's first call about Harwick, about Anna, about the spring of 2000. Richard Calloway had had a relationship with Anna Whitfield during the late 1990s. Anna Whitfield left the estate in late 1999. Diane was born in April 2000. If Richard was Diane's biological father, Ethan's hands went still on the steering wheel. If Richard was Diane's father, then Diane was Richard's daughter. Which made Diane Ethan's half-sister. The thought arrived fully formed and then sat there in the quiet of the car, enormous and silent, like something that had always been true and had simply been waiting for him to catch up to it. He and Diane had been married for 5 years. They had shared a life. And somewhere inside that life, Diane may have known. May have known. He held on to that word, may, because the alternative was something he couldn't look at directly yet. If she had known from the beginning, then their entire marriage had been built on something deliberate and calculated, something she had chosen and maintained for 5 years, through the wedding, through Lily's bedtimes, through the night he had held her while she pretended to grieve a miscarriage that never happened. But if she hadn't known, if she had discovered it somewhere in the middle, after she was already in love, after she was already pregnant, then her disappearance wasn't a betrayal. It was the most desperate kind of honesty she could manage. He didn't know which was true. He didn't know which one he could survive. Everything you thought you understood about Diane just shifted. Drop your reaction in the comments. Did she know from the start, or did she find out after? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter is where the real answer begins to surface, and it's nothing like what any of us expected. Ethan needed to know when. Not what, he knew what now, and the weight of it was almost more than he could carry. What he needed was the timeline. When did Diane find out? Was it before the wedding? Before they met? Had she walked into his life already knowing? Because those two possibilities, finding out before versus finding out after, were not the same story. They were not even close to the same story. One was a calculated deception built from the very beginning. The other was something else entirely. Something he didn't have a word for yet. He hired a forensic digital investigator named Ray Salter. Former federal. Sandra recommended him. Ethan gave him Diane's email accounts, her deleted cloud files, her browser history going back 5 years, everything he had legal access to through their shared accounts. He told Ray he needed a complete picture. Every search. Every document. Every timestamp. Ray said he'd have something in a week. He called back in 4 days. The timeline Ray built was meticulous. Diane's digital history went back further than Ethan expected. She had kept very little, deleted often, but the deletion patterns themselves told a story. What someone chooses to erase, and when, is its own kind of record. 6 months before the charity gala where Ethan and Diane first met, there was a cluster of searches. Calloway estate staff 1990s. Calloway family housekeeper dismissed 1999. Richard Calloway settlement confidential. Anna Whitfield Harwick. She had been looking. Systematically. She had found the settlement document, or at least traces of it, through a legal database available to anyone with a library card and enough patience. She had found Richard's name connected to her mother's departure from the estate. She had known who Richard Calloway was before she ever walked into that gala. Ethan read that part of the report and set it down. He walked to his kitchen. He stood at the counter and looked at the wall and breathed through it. She had known. He picked the report back up. But then Ray's timeline did something unexpected. 3 weeks before the gala, the searches stopped. Completely. Not slowed, stopped. The last search in that cluster was on a Tuesday morning. After that, nothing related to the Calloway family for 6 months. And when Diane attended the gala, Ray had found no communication indicating she planned to approach Ethan specifically. No notes. No messages. Her invitation was standard. She had been added to the guest list through a charitable foundation she volunteered with. Her seat placement was random. There was no documented contact with anyone connected to the Calloway family in the weeks prior. Their meeting had not been arranged. Ethan sat with that for a long time. She had researched his family. She had found the settlement. And then she had stopped, 3 weeks before an event where she had no known plan to seek him out, and walked into a room and met him by accident. Or something that looked like accident. He didn't know what to do with that. It didn't clear her. But it complicated everything the simple version of events had required him to believe. David had filed the motion for Diane's therapist records 2 weeks earlier. The court had resisted. Diane's attorney, she had won, somewhere, working on her behalf through a third party, had filed an objection on grounds of patient confidentiality. The judge overruled it on the basis of the child's welfare. The therapist's name was Dr. Carol Mehta. She had been seeing Diane for 3 years. She submitted a written statement under court order, and Ethan read it in David's office on a Thursday morning while David sat across from him and said nothing. Diane had first mentioned the Calloway name to Dr. Mehta 14 months into their marriage. Not at the beginning. Not before the wedding. 14 months in. She described discovering the biological connection. The word Dr. Mehta used was discovering, not confirming, as something that had happened after she had already fallen in love. She had used a specific phrase during the session that Dr. Mehta had recorded verbatim because it struck her as significant. A door closing on everything. She had not gone to that gala to find Ethan Calloway. She had found him, and then she had found the truth, and by the time she understood what the truth meant, she was already inside a life she had not planned and could not simply walk out of. Ethan looked up from the statement. "There's more," David said quietly. Dr. Mehta's statement continued. After Diane discovered the connection, she had not left immediately. She had stayed. She had considered telling Ethan, had, in fact, according to Dr. Mehta's notes, scheduled a specific conversation with him. A date. A plan. She had decided she was going to tell him everything and let him decide what came next. Then she discovered she was pregnant. And the conversation she had scheduled never happened. Dr. Mehta wrote that Diane had described the pregnancy not as a reason to stay silent permanently, but as a reason she could not find the right moment. Every version of the truth she rehearsed, she said, destroyed something she couldn't afford to destroy while she was carrying his child. She was trying to protect the baby from being born into a crisis. She was trying to find a way to tell Ethan the truth that left him some ground to stand on. She never found it. So she left instead. Not because she stopped loving him. Because she couldn't find a single version of staying that didn't take something irreplaceable from him, and she ran out of time trying. Ethan folded the statement and handed it back to David. He didn't trust his voice enough to speak. Ray called that afternoon with one final item. Among the recovered deleted files, there was a document created at 11:47 p.m., the night before Diane left the hospital. Before she walked out. After the baby was born. It was a letter. Addressed to Ethan. His full name, at the top. Ray asked if Ethan wanted him to read the contents over the phone. Ethan said no. He asked Ray to print it and seal it in an envelope and leave it with Sandra. He needed a day before he could read it. Maybe more. He sat in David's parking lot in the late afternoon light and thought about a woman who had found out the truth after she was already in love, who had carried a secret and a child at the same time, who had spent months looking for a version of honesty that didn't cause damage, and who had finally run out of options and written him a letter at midnight before she disappeared. He thought about what it costs a person to find out they've been asking the wrong question. He was starting to understand. Whatever Diane wrote in that letter, it's going to change the way you see this entire story. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. The letter gets read in Chapter 8, and nothing after it will feel the same. Sandra left the envelope on her desk, as Ethan had asked. He picked it up on a Friday morning without opening it. He drove to the hospital. He asked the nurse if he could use the room, the same room from that first night, which was still assigned to the baby while the placement arrangements were being finalized. The nurse said of course. She brought the baby in, settled him in the bassinet, and left without being asked. Ethan sat down in the chair beside the window. The one where the envelope had been found, 3 weeks ago, the night this all began. He held Diane's letter for a moment. Then he opened it. He read it slowly. He didn't rush. He read certain parts twice. The letter was long, 4 pages, handwritten, the kind of careful handwriting Diane used when she was trying to be precise. Not her everyday script. The handwriting of someone who had rewritten this more than once and finally committed to a version she could live with. She told him she found out 2 months into the pregnancy. Not before, after. She had suspected nothing until a routine blood test returned something unexpected, and she had spent 2 weeks verifying what she already suspected before she let herself fully believe it. She had been hoping she was wrong. She had not been wrong. Ethan's face changed as he read. Not dramatically, a quiet closing, like a door being shut very gently. He kept reading. She wrote that she had considered every option. Not once, repeatedly, over weeks, returning to each one and turning it over and setting it down. She could not end the pregnancy. She sat with that choice long enough to know it was final, and then she stopped revisiting it. She could not tell Ethan the truth while she was carrying the child, not because she was afraid of him, but because she was afraid of what the truth would do to the pregnancy itself. To the first months. To the fragile beginning of something that had not asked to be complicated. She could not stay. That was the last option and the one she returned to most often. She had tried to find a way. Months of trying. And she had not found it. Ethan turned to the 3rd page. She wrote about the birth certificate. She had left the mother's name as the alias because she couldn't use her real name without creating a legal record that would surface on its own timeline, in ways she couldn't control. But she had not put a name in the father field and then crossed it out. She had left it as E. Calloway deliberately. Not as an accusation. As a door she was leaving open. She could not give the child the right to know his own father and then take it back. She wasn't able to do that. Ethan read that paragraph and looked out the window for a moment. The baby made a small sound in the bassinet, not crying, just the ambient sound of a newborn existing, and Ethan looked over at him briefly before returning to the letter. Then came the part about Lily. It was the shortest section of the letter. 3 sentences. Diane had raised Ethan's daughter for 4 years, from the time Lily was 2, when Ethan and Diane married, until now. She had been at every bedtime. Every school morning. Every recital, including the one with the butterfly wings that Lily had called to ask about, the night this all started. Diane wrote that leaving Lily was the part she had not been able to rehearse. That she had tried to write about it and kept stopping. The 3 sentences she landed on were simple. The audience doesn't need to know exactly what they said. What matters is that when Ethan read them, he had to set the letter down on his knee and look at the ceiling for a long time before he could continue. He was quiet for several minutes. Then he turned to the last page. Near the bottom, Diane had written 1 line about the baby. One specific thing she asked Ethan to keep private, not permanently, but until the boy was old enough to receive it on his own terms. She asked Ethan to make that decision when the time came, and to trust himself to know when that was. Ethan read it. He folded that corner of the page over, as if marking it. He would keep it. Whatever it said, he would keep it. He sat with the letter for a few more minutes. The baby had fallen back into the particular deep sleep of the very new. One small hand resting open beside his face. Ethan folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus. Marcus answered on the 2nd ring. He said nothing at first, just waited, the way you wait when you know the call is coming but not what form it will take. Ethan didn't start with an accusation. He didn't revisit the affair, or the hospital, or any of it. He had one question. He asked it quietly. Did she ever say she loved me? The line went silent. Not the silence of someone forming a careful answer. The silence of someone who didn't need to think about the answer at all but needed a moment before he could say it out loud. Marcus said, she never talked about anything else. Ethan ended the call. He sat in the hospital room for another few minutes. The baby slept. Outside, the city continued its ordinary Friday. Somewhere across the country, or beyond it, Diane was in a place he didn't know yet. He thought about a woman who had loved him without reservation and been given an impossible truth, and who had spent months searching for a version of honesty that didn't cost everything, and who had finally made a choice he would have told her not to make, if she had only asked. He thought about how she hadn't asked. And how he was starting to understand why. His phone buzzed. A number he recognized, Richard's attorney. He answered. The attorney was brief and formal, as attorneys tend to be when delivering news that is too significant for warmth. Richard Calloway had revised his will. He was leaving a designated portion of the estate to the child. The child's legal name, as recorded in the revised document, was being drawn from the original birth certificate draft found among Diane's belongings at the apartment. A name Ethan had never chosen. A name he had never heard until this moment. The name Diane had written on a piece of paper, alone, in a secret apartment, sometime before the baby was born, and then left unsigned, uncompleted, on a refrigerator door. Richard had known it. And Richard had used it. As if it had always been true. As if someone had already decided, long before Ethan arrived, exactly who this child was going to be. That name. The one Diane chose, the one Richard confirmed, that's the thread that connects everything. Drop what you're feeling in the comments. And if this story has stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Chapter 9 is where the pieces finally face each other, and the question you've been asking turns out to be the wrong one. David laid it out on the conference table like a map of somewhere no one had ever wanted to go. Documents. Timelines. Legal classifications. The child's biological parentage confirmed. Richard Calloway's relationship to the child running in two directions at once, grandfather through Ethan, and great-grandfather through Diane, if the biological connection held. Which the DNA now confirmed it did. David said the family's legal exposure was significant but manageable. He said there were precedents. He said the word unprecedented twice and then stopped using it. Ethan wasn't listening to the legal part. He was looking at a single line in the custody summary: the child has no registered guardian. Diane had left. Marcus had been removed. Richard was 71 and recovering from a stroke. And Ethan, the biological father, the man whose name was on the birth certificate, had not yet formally claimed anything. What do I need to sign? Ethan asked. David told him. Ethan signed. 2 days later, Ethan brought his father to the hospital. Paul drove them. Richard was quiet in the car, not the closed silence of someone refusing to speak, but the stillness of someone gathering themselves for something they knew would cost them. The nurse brought the baby to a small family room on the 3rd floor. She set him in Richard's arms with the practiced care of someone who had done this 1,000 times and still treated each one as if it mattered. Richard held the boy. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at him, at the small face, the sleeping weight of him, the particular way a newborn exists entirely in the present with no knowledge of anything that came before. Richard looked at his own hands. The hands that had held 2 sons, decades ago. That had built a company and signed a settlement and written "forgive me" on the back of a photograph and then put it in a drawer for 26 years. He said, quietly, I owe him more than a name. It wasn't an apology. It was something older and heavier than that. It was a man at the end of a long reckoning, finally saying out loud what he'd been carrying since 1999. Ethan didn't respond. There was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. That weekend, Ethan took Lily to Diane's apartment. He wasn't sure why, exactly. He told himself it was practical, he needed to clear the unit before the lease expired. But Lily had been asking quiet questions for weeks, the kind that circled around the subject without landing on it, and he thought maybe being in the space would help her understand something he hadn't found the right words for yet. Lily walked through the apartment slowly. She was 6, but she moved through it like she was taking inventory, touching nothing, just looking. The bare kitchen. The made bed. The window that faced the back alley. Then she stopped at the refrigerator. The drawing was still there. The one from weeks ago, the house, the woman, the baby, the figure at the edge labeled D. Lily studied it with the focused seriousness she brought to things that mattered to her. Is that the baby's daddy? She asked. She pointed to the figure labeled D. Or is that you? Ethan looked at the drawing again. He had looked at it before. He had photographed it. He had thought about it. He had assumed the D stood for a person, Diane, or some shorthand for daddy, or something Marcus had been called. But now, standing beside his 6-year-old daughter who saw things plainly because she hadn't yet learned to overcomplicate them, he saw it differently. The D wasn't a figure. It was a door. Drawn open. The straight line of a door frame, the arc of a door swung wide, a small shape next to it that wasn't a person standing guard, it was a threshold. An opening. Diane had drawn a door. Not a person. Not a name. A way through. Ethan stood in that kitchen and let the whole story rearrange itself. The apartment hadn't been a hiding place. It had been a preparation. Stocked, cleaned, quiet, somewhere for her to stay during the months she couldn't stay home. Somewhere she could exist while she figured out what to do next. The false name on the birth certificate wasn't erasure. It was a placeholder. She had left his initial, Ethan Calloway, because she wasn't going to pretend the child had no father. She was holding the space until the truth could fill it properly. The disappearance wasn't abandonment. It was the only move left to someone who had run out of all the other moves. She couldn't stay. She couldn't confess in person. She couldn't hand him a truth that size across a kitchen table and watch what it did to him. So she had written a letter. She had drawn a door. She had left the baby in the hospital where someone would call him. Where Ethan would come. She had always known he would come. Lily tugged his sleeve. "Can we take the drawing?" she asked. "For the baby's room?" He unclipped it from the magnet and folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. "Yeah," he said. "We can take it." His phone buzzed on the drive home. An unknown number. He almost didn't check it. Then something made him look. One message. No name. No explanation. A location. An address. A town name he recognized, Harwick, 400 miles away. The small town where Diane grew up. Where her mother still lived. He pulled over. He sat with the address for a moment. Then he opened the Maps app and typed it in. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a hotel or an apartment. It was a church. Sandra confirmed the rest by that evening. Inside the church's official records, filed with the county 3 days before Diane gave birth, was a legal document. A petition. Signed, witnessed, and notarized. A petition for legal guardianship of a child not yet born. The named guardian was Ethan Calloway. She had filed it before she disappeared. Before she wrote the letter. Before she walked out of that hospital. She had driven 400 miles, walked into a church office, and signed a document that named Ethan as the person who should raise his son. She had planned it. Not at the end, in a panic. Deliberately. Days in advance. She had arranged for him to be the father before she ever gave anyone the chance to question it. The mystery had never been whether she was running from him. She had been running toward the only version of the truth that gave the child something solid to stand on. And she had built it quietly, alone, 400 miles from home, before anyone knew she was gone. Diane planned this before she disappeared. She chose Ethan before he even knew there was a choice to make. Drop what that does to you in the comments, and if you've been watching since chapter 1, subscribe and turn on notifications. The final chapter is where Ethan finds her. And what happens at that kitchen table will stay with you. Ethan drove to Harwick alone. 400 miles. He left before sunrise and didn't stop until the town appeared, small, quiet, the kind of place that looks exactly the same in every season because not enough changes fast enough to notice. He found the street. He found the house. A modest place with a front porch and a garden that someone still tended, even in the cold. He sat in the car for a moment. Then he got out and knocked. Diane opened the door. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a specific thing to arrive and had made her peace with the waiting. She was tired in a real way, not dramatically, not theatrically, just the ordinary tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and hadn't yet put it down. She stepped back from the door and let him in. Her mother's house was small and warm. An older woman was visible through the kitchen doorway, moving slowly, not looking up. Diane led Ethan to the kitchen table, not the living room, not somewhere formal. The kitchen table, with 2 chairs facing each other and a window that looked out at the back garden and nothing else. They sat down. Neither of them started with the obvious. That wasn't who either of them were. Diane spoke first. She said she had not left because she was afraid of him. She wanted him to know that clearly, before anything else. She had never been afraid of Ethan. She had been afraid of what staying would have required, not of him, but of the child. Of what it means to grow up inside a secret that the adults around you are managing on your behalf. She had grown up in proximity to exactly that kind of silence. She knew what it costs a child to sense something true that no one will name. Growing up inside a secret, she said, is different from growing up knowing the truth. One of those things a child can survive and build from. The other one follows them everywhere. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he reached into his jacket and set a document on the table between them. The guardianship petition. The one filed at the church, 3 days before she gave birth. Diane looked at it. Then she looked away, out the window, at the bare garden. A small muscle in her jaw moved once. "You found it," she said. "Sandra found it." A pause. Then, "I knew you would." Ethan said, "You filed it before you left. Before you wrote the letter. Before any of it." She nodded. "Why?" She looked back at him then. Directly. "Because I knew you'd spend the first month trying to talk yourself out of being ready. I filed it so you couldn't argue you weren't. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a justification. It was the most accurate thing anyone had said to him in months, and the most painful, because she was right. He had spent exactly that month doing exactly that. And she had known he would, and she had removed the exit before he could find it. He looked at the document on the table. He picked it up and put it back in his pocket. There was more to say. There was months of it. But not at this table, not today. Some of it would take years. Some of it might not have an ending that felt like an ending. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood up, thanked her mother for the house, and drove back the way he came. Richard Calloway died 2 weeks later. Quietly, in his own bed, on a Tuesday morning in April. Paul was in the next room. Richard had been declining for several days and had seemed, in the last few of them, to be finished with the effort of being somewhere he no longer needed to be. His revised will stood without contest. The child, Ethan's son, received his place in the Calloway family record. Not as a footnote. Not as a complication. As a fact. His name entered the official documentation the same way Ethan's and Marcus's names had entered it decades before. Clean. Permanent. Without asterisk. The Calloway silence, which had been maintained for 26 years through money and paperwork and a photograph in a drawer, ended on a Tuesday in April with the signature of an attorney and a child who would never know it had existed. Lily met her brother on a Saturday. Ethan had tried to prepare her. He had used simple words, age-appropriate explanations, the kind of careful language you practice in the car on the way over. Lily had listened to all of it and then asked if the baby liked dinosaurs, and Ethan had said he was a little young for opinions, and Lily had said that was fine, she could teach him. When they arrived, she walked up to the bassinet with the same serious focus she brought to all important things. She looked at him for a long time. He was awake, looking up at the ceiling with the unfocused curiosity of a 2-month-old. Then Lily leaned down and studied his ears very carefully. "His ears are funny," she announced. She extended one finger over the edge of the bassinet, cautious, deliberate. The baby's hand, doing nothing in particular, drifted sideways and closed around it. Lily went completely still. She didn't pull away. She just stood there, holding very still, looking at the small hand wrapped around her finger with an expression Ethan had never seen on her face before. Not quite wonder. Something quieter. Something that looked like recognition. She stayed like that for a long time. Later that evening, after the nanny had taken Lily home and the hospital room had gone quiet, Ethan sat in the chair by the window with his son in his arms. No one else was in the room. No lawyers, no investigators, no documents requiring signatures. Just the two of them and the particular quality of late evening light that comes through hospital windows and makes everything feel slightly outside of ordinary time. The baby was awake. He looked up at Ethan with the dark, unfocused eyes that would eventually settle into a color no one had predicted yet. His hand rested open against Ethan's arm. Ethan thought about a nurse who had turned around to find an empty room. He thought about an envelope on a chair. He thought about a photograph in a drawer and 4 words spoken by a dying man and a drawing of a door left on a refrigerator for someone to find. He thought about a woman at a kitchen table in a small town, 400 miles away, who had made every decision she made because she understood something about this child that Ethan was only beginning to understand now. That a child doesn't need a perfect story. He needs a true one. The baby's hand closed, then opened again. Closed. Opened. Ethan didn't move. Outside, the city continued. The Calloway name continued. The silence that had run underneath everything for 26 years was gone now, broken not by a courtroom or a confession or a dramatic confrontation, but by a child who had arrived without asking permission and refused, simply by existing, to be a secret. Ethan sat with both of those things, the weight of what had happened, and the specific, impossible lightness of what was in his arms, and did not try to resolve them into one feeling. Some things are large enough to hold more than one truth at the same time. He was learning that. 10 chapters. One story. And somehow it ends not with an answer, but with a child's hand opening and closing, and a man learning to hold 2 truths at once. If this series moved you, share it with someone who needs a story like this. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We'll see you there.